When 13 disparate British colonies united to form a new country, they followed a model that already existed. It was provided for them by the United States of Haudenosaunee. That's the land that the British and French invaders had been fighting over for 150 years, until one rainy night in 1754, when a 22-year-old British soldier ambushed a French diplomatic party, killing them mercilessly and kicking off a world war. That kid's name was George Washington. Meanwhile, back in London, the Board of Trade was very concerned. I mean, they needed the Haudenosaunee as an ally. So they directed their colonies to sign a treaty with the Haudenosaunee. Pennsylvania sent Ben Franklin, and Franklin's printing press had been quoting their chief Connecticut's words on unity for years. Franklin and Washington were both deeply familiar with their revolutionary system of government. Haudenosaunee means people of the Long House, referring to the 5 nations and then 6 that had once been at war but had miraculously unified 1,000 years prior. That's when a messenger called the Great Peacemaker demonstrated how easy it was to break one arrow, then bundled 5 arrows together and showed how in unity they could not be broken. The Peacemaker had partnered with Hiawatha and Chick-un-Sesa, the Mother of Nations, to establish a democratic council of clan and village chiefs from all their nations. Power was shared between sexes, decisions were made by consensus, and they symbolized this new democratic alliance. By uprooting an old pine and all the formerly warring leaders, they threw their weapons of hatred and jealousy and anger and war into the chasm left by the old tree, and a mighty stream washed it away. They replanted a new tree of peace, placing an eagle on top, symbolizing the intention to keep a watchful eye toward any disturbances to their peace. Now, many scholars have enumerated the ways in which Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan, the basis for the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, were similar to the Haudenosaunee Constitution. And on July 4th, 1776, after declaring independence, Congress directed Franklin and others to oversee the creation of a seal for the newly United States. And in October of 1988, the 100th U.S. Congress recognized the Haudenosaunee Confederacy as follows. Quote, whereas the original framers of the Constitution, including most notably George Washington and Ben Franklin, are known to have greatly admired the concepts of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, whereas the confederation of the original 13 colonies into one republic was influenced by the political system developed by the Iroquois Confederacy, as were many of the democratic principles, which were incorporated into the Constitution itself. In 1781, as the Revolutionary War for Liberty began to rage against Britain, a woman held captive in the Massachusetts colony named Bet overheard her captors in conversations with a dinner guest, a lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick. And what piqued her attention specifically was their descriptions of British tyranny and manifestos for independence that they were writing and sharing. And these concepts of liberty were dear to her heart. So Bet learned that the man who'd held her captive and this lawyer, John Sedgwick, were both authors of something called the Sheffield Declaration, a colonial petition against tyranny, a manifesto for individual rights, a document which became the precursor to the Declaration of Independence. These men that she was overhearing had written this foundational American document in this house in which Bet was now imprisoned. And she remembered those words when she risked her life and escaped, because Bet had been violently abused. She'd been struck by a burning hot kitchen shovel trying to protect another captive, and it had left her forever scarred. She found Theodore Sedgwick, and he took on her case, and they challenged in court the very idea of slavery based on the wording of the Massachusetts Constitution that her captor's peers had just written. So in a landmark decision, the jury agreed and awarded Bet her freedom plus financial damages. And within 2 years, Massachusetts abolished slavery for good. That was the same year the United States won its independence. Well, Bet took on the name Elizabeth Freeman and accepted a paid job working for Sedgwick. As we look back toward the ancestors who put their lives on the line, whose shoulders we stand on, one of those giants is Elizabeth Freeman, a founding mother in our world's ongoing mission for basic human rights. hear a lot of people saying that we shouldn't judge America's founding fathers with the moral standards of today because that would be unfair. It's a different time. But the moral standards of today existed back then. James Otis, the guy who said taxation without representation's tyranny, also wrote, "The colonists are by the law of nature freeborn, as indeed all men are, white or black." Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, he said to be deluded into thinking that one race is inferior to another is so foreign to the human mind that the moral faculties, as well as those of the understanding, are debased and rendered torpid by it. Torpid means lifeless. Gouverneur Morris, whose pen wrote the Constitution, said slavery would bring the curse of heaven upon us. Thomas Paine inspired the American Revolution. He called slavery monstrous and slavers desperate wretches. Ben Franklin's friend Ben Lay called slavers the spawn of Satan to their faces. Then there were the men, women, and children enduring forced labor who petitioned numerous courts at the time, quoting the Declaration of Independence. So how come it still took millions of people, centuries, to apply what were clear moral standards back then? Vermont passed laws right away during the Revolution. But the rest of the North took another 20 years before they would shut it down. And the calls for moderation made the process brutal. In Pennsylvania, ending slavery applied only to the next generation of Americans. And then they'd face racial murders and cross-burnings and riots as slavery just continued to rage on in the South. There are a lot of people who claim that the United States was a leader in establishing freedom for all, but the Haitians were the first to overthrow this crime against humanity. Britain was next. Mexico was next. Then France. It cost the sacrifices of a global movement, a civil war that killed 2% of our country, and the assassination of an American president, before we could apply what was a clear moral standard from the start. Why? The danger with romanticized, idealized origin stories is they deprive us the perspective and humility that are required to overcome supremacist, chosen person delusions. That's the test this country has so far failed. So to the question, wasn't everyone a racist in the 1700s? Just the ones we made into statues. There's an old famous book that says, whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. A free society can't worship idols of power, greed, cruelty, narcissism, arrogance, without becoming enslaved to our worst instincts. Our ancestors with moral standards were not often cast in stone or iron. And maybe that's not so bad, because they live on in the spirit of our humanity, values that have existed since the dawn of time. For most of our history, our country was racially segregated by law, until a woman born on the 4th of July, whose family had lived on this land for thousands of years, moved to her state capital and saw signs that said no dogs, no natives. Elizabeth Peratrovich and her husband Roy and their children were Tlingit, people of the tides, indigenous to the Pacific Northwest coast. But they were outcasts on their own land. They weren't allowed to move into any nice neighborhoods or put their kids into good schools. Well, that's not the country in which Elizabeth and Roy wanted to raise their children. So Elizabeth became the Grand President of the Alaska Native Sisterhood, and her husband became a leader of the Alaska Native Brotherhood. The U.S. had just entered World War II, and they wrote to the governor, "Our Native boys are just as willing as the white boys to lay down their lives and protect the freedom you enjoy." Well, the governor agreed, and Elizabeth and Roy began making even more powerful allies. Alberta Schenck recently had gone to the movies with her date, a white army sergeant. They sat in the whites-only section. But since Alberta's mother was Inupiaq, Alberta was arrested, and she spent the night in jail. Well, the community rallied, and the mayor joined their protests. And they all petitioned for radical regulations, the first of their kind, in any American territory, equal access, equal opportunity. This is a concept that was despised. But Elizabeth and Roy, they kept whipping up support year after year until they had a lobbying power that was unstoppable. And in 1945, their bill got public hearings. The most powerful testimony came from Elizabeth herself. She spoke for 2 hours. She faced down Juneau's Senator Alan Shattuck. This guy was a shameless segregationist. Shattuck said, far from being brought closer together, the races should be kept farther apart. Who are these people, barely out of savagery, who want to associate with us, whites, with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind us? And Elizabeth responded, well, I would not have expected that I, who am barely out of savagery, would have to remind a gentleman with 5,000 years of recorded civilization behind him of our Bill of Rights. And with that, the very first American Anti-Discrimination Act passed. 11-5. Slowly, painfully, these protests gathered steam across the country. The famous Woolworth's lunch counter sit-ins, they would start a decade and a half later. This movement grew until Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, and the Supreme Court ruled on Loving versus Virginia. And only then was legal segregation regulated into oblivion. But as Jamel Bouie just wrote, segregation remains a fundamental part of the social order and political economy of the United States. And its effects are profound and twofold. First of all, 400 years of racial terrorism on 20 generations creates, logically, a brutal lack of equal access to housing, real estate, financial resources, education, healthcare. Without repairs, participation in the full economy becomes a hereditary privilege. The second effect is that with Americans segregated geographically, and therefore culturally, we are not united and more easily exploited. The brave, freedom-fighting work of our native leaders and founding mothers, Elizabeth Peratrovich and Alberta Schenck, was just the beginning. For over 300 million years, Florida was part of Gondwana land, a supercontinent that was Africa and South America. And then more recently, it belonged to the native peoples who lived there for at least 12,000 years. Then in the 1500s, Spain invaded and renamed it La Florida, which is Spanish, and it means an abundance of flowers. But without the law, Florida just means flowery. So flowery was a huge territory that included all of present-day Florida, plus portions of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Louisiana. And Spain occupied flowery by force for 300 years, angering and displacing all the nations who already lived there, until 1754. And then this 22-year-old kid, British soldier, named George Washington, ambushed a French diplomatic party, and he kicked off a world war over this land. So native nations made the impossible choice of picking which of these foreign intruders would be the least destructive. The Haudenosaunee, who the French called the Iroquois, the Catawba, and the Cherokee, they all went with Britain, and Britain won. And that was great news because King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Any new European settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains would be forbidden. This land would be reserved for native populations only in perpetuity, meaning forever. But Britain was going to keep flowery. 20 years later, the British colonists revolted against their king and massacred their former native allies. Britain abandoned flowery, giving it back to Spain. And all three superpowers continued to violate treaties with the people who'd lived here in the first place for 12,000 years. Then 25 years later, President Jefferson and Secretary of State James Madison decided to purchase the entire middle of the continent west of the Appalachians from the French who'd just taken it from Spain, doubling the size of the newly united and formerly British colonies. Now, there was enormous opposition to this from Congress, not to mention the citizens of the nations who'd lived here for 12,000 years, making a pretty straightforward case that nobody really had the legal authority to sell it to anybody. Well, the newly united and formerly British colonies, they ignored those claims, and in fact, they decided that sale of the middle of the continent to them also included West Flowery. Formerly British and now independent slavers began invading, sending slave hunters to raid black Seminole villages. Spanish flowery ceased to exist in 1821, when Spain ceded control to the newly United States. And then 84 years later, in 1904, a family of migrants fled the monarchy of Italy and arrived in Pennsylvania looking for jobs and opportunities. 74 years later, their great-grandson was born in Flowery. He grew up there and used millions of taxpayer dollars and migrants like his ancestors as props to lecture the country about illegal immigration. Democratic Republican used to describe one political party. Founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, it was the formal name given to anti-federalists, those who were opposed to the Constitution, opposed to too strong a central government like the kind favored by George Washington. Washington warned, splitting into political parties, that's going to mean a return to monarchy, because rival factions always long for a king to embody the spirit of revenge. That George Washington's opposition party would split into a culture-warring duopoly, financed by big corporations, that would have been his worst nightmare. Because anti-corporate sentiment, that was a fundamental inspiration for the entire revolution. That tea that the Sons of Liberty threw into the Boston Harbor belonged to the British East India Company, the very first international corporation. The East India Company had its own armed forces, 70,000 troops, and that grew to nearly 300,000 troops in the 1800s. The company invaded India, seized land, resources, levied its own taxes. India was a global superpower producing over a third of the world's goods and services until the East India Company decimated their economy. And the company would trade in anything, including opium, illegally, which led to a war with China. But Britain considered them too big to fail, so they were nationalized, and the company's legacy is known today as the British Empire, which the former British colonies rebelled against, with the financial backing of France, Spain, and Denmark. Now, to pay them back, newly independent American businesses needed to thrive so they could be taxed under the new centralized powers provided by the US Constitution. And for businesses to thrive, they needed to be free from the economic tyrannies like those imposed by the East India Company. So for the longest time, to preserve a functioning democracy, most corporations were not allowed to operate outside their home state, and in some cases not even outside their home county. There were limits on company size, all kinds of restrictions on behavior and ownership, and that lasted all the way through until the Civil War, when the railroads were consolidated. And that allowed them to grow so large that they took over related industries and formed trusts that controlled more and more of the entire economy. Now, throughout the 1900s, antitrust legislation was a foundational notion for free enterprise, a requirement for economic and political freedom. But large-scale propaganda efforts, financed by those trusts, convinced enough Americans the antitrust movement was just big government bureaucracy, and so the US government abandoned its enforcement. And now, of course, most of America's industries are dominated by a handful of trusts that can coordinate prices and production. They suppress innovation and competition. They have no accountability, and of course they can raise prices under the cover of inflation. Prior to the 1970s, there were no companies that had lobbyists. Now they spend billions on it. In George Washington's farewell address, he warned voters, don't let your attachments to state or region divide you and lose the independence and liberty your union provides. Well, perhaps there were some seeds of wisdom there.